Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, Kevin Rudd accuses the Coalition of fraud over its costings as the Coalition accuses Labor of undermining Treasury. A former state Labor minister found to be corrupt for the second time this year. And WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange will join us live from London. Our panel tonight, Simon Cowan from the Centre for Independent Studies, Daily Telegraph columnist Sarah Lamarquand, and in Melbourne, columnists with The Guardian Australia and The Drum Online, Greg Jericho. And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum. Well, the row between the federal government and the opposition over costings has once again dominated the election campaign. Yesterday, the government said Treasury and Parliamentary Budget Office costings showed a $10 billion hole in the coalition's savings. But last night, the Treasury and Finance departments issued a statement making it clear the figures were based on policy options, not policies, and were not prepared under the election costings commitments process outlined in the Charter of Budget Honesty Act. The opposition wants an apology.
What the government has been saying has been a lie, and I have never seen this occur before.
We stand by every word that we said yesterday.
As the day wore on, neither party was prepared to give ground.
This is a Prime Minister who gets his own costings wrong massively, and now he's getting our costings wrong. And the point I make is that if Kevin Rudd is talking about costings while he's moving his lips, you know he's not telling the truth.
Greg, is Labor's campaign in tatters over this?
Well, it's hard to say because we don't know what we're comparing it with. The Liberal Party is saying that the Labor's costings are all wrong, but they're asking us just to believe that on faith. We have absolutely no idea how the Liberal Party has arrived at the numbers that it's got. And this is the thing that continues to kind of astound me, especially when I see all the reporting that we had today, is that the Liberal Party has still not released its costings. On Wednesday, when Joe Hockey and Andrew Robb had their big press conference and they said, oh, look at our $31 billion savings, that's not costings, that's just numbers. And numbers actually are a nice headline and look really good, but they don't actually tell us how the numbers were arrived at. And I think there has been a real sort of mass sort of confusion over actually what are we after here, and what we're really after is the assumptions behind all those numbers, and we haven't got them yet.
But Greg, why did Labor release information last night that was based on policy options, not the actual coalition policies?
Well, because governments always do that. I mean, Peter Costello would do this all the time. It's what governments do when they hear an opposition announce a policy or announce they're going to, for example, cut the public service by 12,000 numbers. So what governments always do is we get the Treasury and say, if we were going to cut the public service by 12,000 people, how much is that going to cost us, or how much is it going to save us? And then they were able to release that. Now, when they released these yesterday, there was no suggestion that it was anything else but the fact that they were doing it on the assumptions of what had been stated by the Liberal Party. In fact, in the press conference, that question was even asked. I think it was Alex Hart of Channel 7 asked the Treasury, said, how can you be sure that these costings are right because they're based on assumptions that might be out of date? And Chris Bowen said, I couldn't say it any better myself. And it's a case of let's see what we're comparing apples with apples with.
All right. Let's take a listen to what Kevin Rudd said about this today.
I can see no higher political fraud committed against the Australian people than having in your back pocket a series of costings and cuts you already say are done, and then giving no excuse as to why you're leaving them in your back pocket until election eve.
Simon, what are your thoughts on how Labor's handled this?
Look, I think they've handled it relatively poorly. I think for whatever they might have said during the questions and the fact that they've carefully qualified their statements with this is based on assumptions, the fact is it's been presented as if these are the coalition policies they've costed and there's a hole in it. I think there is some brickbats to be given to the coalition for the point that Greg made, which is they haven't released their costings yet. And the arguments that Labor didn't release their costings, to me, are not good enough. I think we can ask for more in our political debate than we've seen so far. The intervention by Treasury and Finance is, to me, quite an extraordinary step. It takes a lot to get the public servants to intervene in an election debate, though, and that of itself, regardless of the fighting between the two parties, the intervention of the Treasury officials is what makes this look really bad.
And the coalition hasn't been questioning the independence of Treasury over the last 24 hours?
No, just the last 24 hours, all of a sudden they've come back on board with Treasury. I mean, I think the intervention of the Parliamentary Budget Office as well is also important. When they really came out and said these aren't the coalition policies we've costed, I think at that point Labor probably should have walked away from it.
Sarah, what have you made of this debate in the last 24 hours?
Well, I think listening to both leaders there, it's pretty obvious the script is that the coalition are accusing the government of being liars and the government is accusing the coalition of fraud. And that's fairly inflammatory language all round. I would have to agree with Simon. I think whether the coalition is dragging its heels or not, and clearly it is, it's a really bad look for the government to have this unprecedented move of the head of Treasury and Finance publicly contradicting them. And, you know, obviously the fact that the coalition's figures have seemed a little bit doubtful, that's really been the strongest weapon that the government has been able to use against the coalition. And so this is a bit of an own goal, really, that the smoking gun didn't turn out to be so smoking after all.
Greg, what do you make of the intervention of the head of Treasury and head of Finance?
Well, I mean, it depends how you read it. I mean, the Treasury and the Finance one starts off with talking specifically about the reporting of these things. So you could take it as meaning that perhaps the reporting of it has gone a bit too far and they're a bit worried that it's coming across as though these are the actual costings, which if that was the case, then Treasury are doing something they shouldn't have done, and so I think they're worried about that. The Parliamentary Budget Office actually did the same thing back in May when I think it was Phil Curry got a bit of a leak on the paid parental leave costings that I think came either via the Greens or via Labor, we don't know who. But back then the PBO put out a statement saying, look, we're not costing opposition policies or policies of other parties, and we want to make that clear. And I think the introduction of the PBO in this election has really, I think, changed the dynamic a bit, and there's this real desire on the part of the bureaucracy and the public service to make it clear that we're costing only things that have been provided to us and based on the assumptions that are provided to us, and we're not doing other parties' costings. And I think there was that real sense, I think, last night that they want that to be clear.
All right, well, our first guest tonight on the drum is Julian Assange, who holds the #1 spot on the WikiLeaks party's Senate ticket in Victoria. The fledgling party has had a difficult time over the last week or so. One candidate, Leslie Cannane, resigned, and 4 members of the National Council also left, citing concerns about transparency and democracy inside the party structure. Well, Julian Assange joins us now via webcam from Ecuador's embassy in London. Julian, welcome to the drum.
G'day.
Now, after it was revealed your party had preferenced the Shooters and Fishers Party and also the White Nationalist Australia First Party in New South Wales, you initially blamed administrative errors and over-delegating, but emails that have been leaked to the Crikey website show that you were involved in internal discussions about preference deals. At what point did you know the plans for each candidate's preference deals?
Oh, come on. You can go to the Australian WikiLeaks Party website, wikileaksparty.org.au, to read the full statement. Now, in relation, which I just read, by the way, this thing on Crikey just minutes ago, the email that has been accepted by me, in fact, I am proud of, is an email not about preferences. It is an email to make sure that candidates get their nomination forms in. And all the candidates were, in fact, correctly nominated and correctly registered with the Australian Electoral Commission.
So you're saying this email has nothing to do with preferences?
In part, because I gave such a detailed tasking instruction. So that is simply false.
OK, but it does deal... This email does deal with preference. It says preference negotiations are the single most important factor now in winning this campaign. And you say in this email you propose that you will assess the proposed final negotiations. Did you assess those final negotiations over preference deals?
Well, that's another email you are now speaking about. That email I am also proud about. That is an email to make sure there would be no errors, to make sure I, as party leader, the person who is responsible ultimately to the public through my reputation and through the ballot box, would make sure that there was no mistakes, both in terms of administrative errors and both in terms of any other party, you'll notice in there, acting like some kind of pushing one of our candidates or capturing one of our candidates to work in a manner that is against what we stand for.
So did you assess the negotiations that led to WikiLeaks preferencing the Shooters and Fishers party?
Please listen. But that tasking request was rejected by those very people that resigned from National Council, and me, busy here in London with other matters, decided to not push it to the vote. So in fact, that tasking request to make sure that I would assess all preferences and present that to the National Council, that tasking request was not carried out. That never became an instruction of the party because it was blocked by those very people that correctly resigned from National Council.
I'll bring up another part of one of the emails published by Crikey, and in it you admit a great deal of time is being spent on preference deals. Now that makes it sound like these deals were strategically negotiated to maximise the WikiLeaks vote and were not part of some administrative error as you have previously made out.
But it is simply false. Where I'm running in Victoria, no one has any complaint about the preferences. The spin that is being put around, which first started by the Greens campaign manager in New South Wales, Max someone, that concerns who we had in the 18th or something preference slot. Look, it is the nature of the Australian Senate election that you have to preference every single party, whether you like it or not. We don't, in fact, like it, but you have to put everyone, including everyone that you don't like, you have to put them on your preference form. And
sure, and you make strategic decisions, do you not, so you can get elected?
The Greens did a dirty deal with the ALP, and part of that dirty deal with the ALP was to insist that all WikiLeaks candidates for the Senate were pushed well after the Greens. Now, the ALP was going to preference us before the Greens. It is quite normal amongst the parties to put the big parties last, and that includes the Greens because they have become a big party. So it's very normal amongst minor parties to do that, and we did that, and in fact we were forced into that position because of the Greens' deal with the ALP. Similarly, the Greens also have attempted to knock off the whistleblower Andrew Wilkie in Tasmania. They're in coalition in government with Tasmania, with the ALP.
Why is it that your mother is endorsing the Greens Senator Scott Ludlam over the WikiLeaks party in WA?
Well, I endorse the individual Scott Ludlam. Scott Ludlam is a fine man in the Senate. He's a personal friend of mine, and also in terms of the personal policies that he's pushed in the Senate. He's a good bloke. I am not a politician, although I'm running for election.
Well, you're running for election. You are a politician, I'm sorry.
I am not a politician, and I don't believe that we should go, oh, we're opposed to this party or that party, etc. Carte blanche. There are good people in nearly all the parties in Australia, not many, but there are some. And Scott Ludlam is one of them, and I think it's important to recognise those individuals. Similarly, in WA, David Miranda, the WA candidate there, Jerry Georgitos, believes that he's a good man from the Australian National Party, the first Australian Aboriginal candidate in WA national history.
Oh, OK. You called yourself, well, you said you weren't a politician, which I think a lot of people would dispute because you're running for office, but you also referred to yourself before as leader. Now, in that email, you say that you're the president of the WikiLeaks party. How did you become the president of the WikiLeaks party?
I founded it.
So you appointed yourself the president?
I mean, seriously, this is so fantastic. Look at the name. It is the WikiLeaks party. The prominent candidate is Julian Assange. Who founded it? I founded it.
OK, so are we talking president for life here, or what are we talking about?
There's a drum turned into a comedy show.
Well, The reason I ask is there's nowhere in your constitution does it say that there is a leader of the WikiLeaks party. It doesn't say that there's a president of the WikiLeaks party. And I'm just wondering if you have appointed yourself the president of the WikiLeaks party. And it's a crucial question because WikiLeaks is meant to pride itself for transparency and democracy. And I'm curious if there's internal democracy inside your party.
I honestly can't believe that you are serious. I founded the party. I am the president of the National Council. I mean, really, where are you trying to go with this? It's hilarious. Okay, we are right now before an election with very, very serious matters occurring. The WikiLeaks party is a new party, a fledgling party. Of course it has teething problems. We have over 2,000 members. We are growing at around 20 members per day during this election. That's a very impressive result. Polling shows over multiple polls from the Australian Labor Party's own polling outfit, UMR, from Ray Morgan Research, that I have between 25 and 28% of the voting intention in Australia, 40% of the voting intention for people under the age of 30. That's an extremely important phenomenon. There's other important phenomena in this election, which is, in fact, the very interesting role of new parties in this election. There are more than double the number of parties as last election. In fact, this has been the greatest amount of new political organisations since the Great Depression.
Okay, Simon Cowan's got a question for you.
Very important
Simon?
things are happening into Australian politics, and you have a desire to go into minutiae which is simply wrong and not consequential.
Well, I think it's consequential that we found out that you appointed yourself president of the WikiLeaks party. Simon, you've got a question?
I'd like to go into things that were a little bit more consequential. You've suggested that you're the prominent party in the head and basically the embodiment of the WikiLeaks party, yet you're holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy with little chance of leaving. You said yourself you've been focused more on Edward Snowden and the campaign, and the WikiLeaks party seems to primarily have policies around transparency and accountability. I've seen no evidence of policies in relation to economics, healthcare, education, defence. If you are asking people to vote for you, how is it that you've managed to avoid dealing with more or less all of the consequential issues in Australian politics at the moment?
Because every single issue in Australian politics is a matter of the function and behaviour of government. Every single issue.
I agree, but not from the same perspective as you, I suspect.
I'm not going to lie to the Australian people. We are a party for the Senate. We are not a party of government, and we pride ourselves on not being a party of government. We are a party of accountability and oversight. I'm not going to magic a multi-billion-dollar defence policy out of the sky that we would have no hope of implementing. Our role is to not be in the government. Our role is independent precisely because we are not in the government. Our role is to make the bastards honest, not to join them.
But how will you do that from the Ecuadorian embassy, Mr Assange?
We will do this in precisely the same way that WikiLeaks, as a publisher, as the most famous investigative journalism outfit in the world, and arguably the most successful, has done that by understanding, scrutinising, looking at networks of association, looking at who's mates with who, looking at the complexity and detail of policy, bringing that to the public and presenting it. Regardless of who you vote for, the reality is that the ALP or the coalition, or the ALP with the Greens, is going to form government. Now, they've made lots and lots of promises during this election. They wouldn't reveal the costings for the coalition until 10 days out, a completely absurd matter. We all know that once they get in, small changes in economic conditions, such as a change in commodities prices or whatever, will be used as an excuse to shift and modify those policies. So there has to be a mechanism to scrutinise the promises that whatever party brings to government brings. Okay. It doesn't just do favours for its mates. And that is the role of the WikiLeaks party.
Sarah, yes, you got a question?
Yes, of course we have a number of policies, and you can go to the wikileaksparty.org.au website, but they are predominantly policies about oversight, about media and so on, because it would be absurd for for a party of oversight in the Senate to be pretending that it would be introducing multi-billion-dollar policies.
Sarah?
Julian, you've conceded that you've had to over-delegate to members of your Australian party so as to allow you to focus on things such as Edward Snowden's defence. But given it was always fairly likely that there were going to be some pretty substantial matters to distract you, why choose this election to run for the Senate?
Because, as opposed to waiting 3 years' time. I announced that I would be running for the Senate before I came into this embassy. Look, if you believe in certain principles, if you believe in both justice and liberty, two very important notions, both from the right and left of politics, and you've had some successes in some domains, and suddenly another domain opens up, you can't just abandon the field. Now, it happened to be the case that we started to receive polling that we didn't even commission. In fact, the Australian, seems the pollster UMR commissioned it, the Labor Party's pollster. And that made us understand that, in fact, there was an enormous degree of political support for the values that I have fought for 20 years in Australia. And it's critical to not abandon the ground. Plato said the cost of not engaging in politics is to be ruled over by your inferiors. Well, Plato, he was a bit of a fascist, but you can understand the sentiment that if you abandon the field, someone else will come in and they're going to do something you don't like. And we actually all have responsibilities to take up the mantle that other people hope for us. And the Australian people, at least many of them, hope that I will bring something different to Australia in the same way that I've managed to bring it to some other parts of the world.
Julian, a quick final question before we let you go. Quick question. If you believe in transparency, why do people who work at WikiLeaks have to sign confidentiality agreements?
Of the other candidates that have joined me in that endeavour. Binoy Kampmak, my running mate in Victoria, a very well-regarded international relations scholar. Kelly Tranch in New South Wales, very well-regarded human rights lawyer.
Okay.
Alison Brokowski, former Australian diplomat in New South Wales.
All right, we've got to wrap up there, Julian.
Well-regarded Australian investigative journalist and campaigner, PhD on Aboriginal deaths in custody. This is the calibre of people that we are attracting. And why? Not because these parties are, not because these candidates are part of some political dynasty like they are in the AFP. Not because they're career makers. No, these are people with a fierce, independent record of fighting for justice and fighting for truth.
OK, Julian Assange, we've got to leave it there. Thanks very much for coming on The Drum tonight.
You're welcome.
And moving on to other issues now, and former New South Wales Labor Minister Ian McDonald has been found corrupt for the second time this year. The Independent Commission Against Corruption says Mr McDonald acted corruptly when he awarded a coal mining licence to former union boss John Maitland. The ICAC has referred both Mr Maitland and Mr McDonald to the public prosecutor for possible criminal charges. The coalition has been eager to link state Labor's troubles with the federal campaign. Kevin Rudd says he's taken steps to reform his party's New South Wales branch.
What I'm concerned about is whether any individual, through any substantial accusation of corruption or any proof of corruption, brings the Australian Labor Party into disrepute, and they should be dealt with not only A, with the full force of the law. There is no place in the modern Australian Labor Party for any such people. That's why I ordered federal intervention into the party.
Sarah, not great timing for Labor, this one?
Not at all, and in fact particularly bad given that the Coalition have just unrolled a new ad that specifically seeks to capitalise on, the ALP's stench in New South Wales. I don't know how well any of this translates outside of New South Wales, but then given almost 1 in 3 Australians live in New South Wales, that's enough voters, isn't it?
Greg, what do you think the impact of this kind of scandal is on Labor in a campaign where they're not doing very well?
Well, I don't know if it's going to have much of an additional negative to it because it's already the whole Abid and McDonald thing is that smell is just lingering there, and I don't think this makes it any more pungent. I kind of think this whole thing is a little bit, it's like the whole myth about someone putting prawn heads in curtain rods so it stinks out their house. I mean, I think it doesn't matter what Rudd says about trying to clean up the ALP. He's going to be searching around for where the hell that smell is. He's never going to be able to get rid of it until the whole hearings are finished. And, you know, it's obviously not good for the ALP. I don't know if it makes it... It's not a case of, oh, we'd forgotten about that. We didn't know there was all this corruption or alleged corruption going on. But... you know, I think it's just something Rudd's going to have to wear.
Simon, does the Liberal government have to look at cancelling the mine licence and freezing the profits from this mine?
Well, as far as I'm aware, ICAC have not yet made any recommendations about what to do with the licence. And in at least one of the cases, the licence has subsequently been transferred to a different company that has different shareholders who are not associated with the underlying dubious nature of the award. So whatever happens here, I think there's going to be some collateral damage, there's going to be some problems. I think punishing the people who bought the licence not knowing any of this backstory may not be the best idea, but at the same time I think it's worth waiting to see what ICAC has to say. From a perspective of how this appears for Labor, I mean, it's bad timing for a campaign that was starting to stall anyway. Greg's right, we haven't yet forgotten about it, I think, but that little reminder, just at a point when, you know, you're talking about trust and fraud and those sort of things, it's not a great optic. And again, we should remember that these are ICAC findings. They have not yet been found guilty by a court of law. Should that happen, then we would like to hope that they'll be dealt with swiftly. All
right. Well, the Prime Minister was in Perth today to unveil Labor's latest plan for Australia's cities. A re-elected Rudd government would create a suburban growth task force and appoint the country's first cities minister.
Cities is where 70% plus of Australians live and where 80% of our national wealth is generated. And therefore, we have ministers in the Australian government for regional development. We have ministers in the Australian government responsible for our primary industries. The time has come to have a minister responsible for our cities as well.
Tony Abbott began the day in Melbourne where he launched the opposition's mental health policy. The Coalition wants to give $18 million to Patrick McGorry's youth mental health centres. An Abbott government would also ask the Mental Health Commission to examine the nation's existing programs.
There is essentially a bipartisan agreement that mental health is the silent epidemic of modern times. We do have to do more, and by investing more money in mental health treatments, we will, over time, be a more productive society.
The Prime Minister revealed his mental health policy last night. Kevin Rudd was taking part in an online forum when one user asked for his mental health plans. The PM then vowed to spend $34 million on the 10 new Headspace centres. Mr Rudd said he was intending to unveil the policy in a few days anyway, but since someone asked, he was happy to let the plan out early. Greg, let's go back to the Minister for Cities idea. What do you think of that one?
Oh, it's wonderful. It's really been what's missing in Australian politics, someone caring about people who live in our cities. We don't really have that. I mean, God damn, I mean, for someone who's a bit of a policy wonk, this election's really been fairly dispiriting for me. I mean, we've had differential company tax proposals for Northern Territory, and now we're getting this seemingly thought bubble of the Minister for Cities. I mean, what would he or she do, I mean, that isn't already covered by, say, the Minister for Infrastructure? I mean,
or
Kevin
the state
Rudd
ministers.
Yeah, or the state ministers. I mean, Kevin Rudd said that the minister would be worrying about congestion and so forth. Well, we've got Infrastructure Australia, who already have got a number of recommendations about things that can be spent on infrastructure, on rail and roads to overcome that. Oh, God, this
All
is
right,
frustrating.
Sarah, do you share Greg's scepticism on this one?
Well, I think it really, of course, what Greg says is technically correct. These are portfolios that are already taken care of. But the fact is most of our major capital cities are suffering from a lack of infrastructure. And I think the idea might actually resonate, particularly in Western Sydney, where let's face it, this is solely where this policy announcement was.
So you should have just said
pitched.
the Minister for Western Sydney, do you think?
Exactly.
Isn't Barry Farrell the Minister for Western Sydney? Is that, am I right in thinking that?
Simon, what are your thoughts on this one?
Look, the last thing I think we need is another minister with a poorly defined portfolio with a bunch of bureaucrats reporting to him and no clear objective. There is an issue with infrastructure in our cities. The likelihood that appointing a separate minister is going to solve it, I think, is roughly zero. What we really need to do is we need to address the funding disparity between the states and the feds for infrastructure and put together a depoliticised process that actually gets infrastructure priorities, not pork barrelling at the front.
Sarah, what do you think about this idea that is a positive issue on both sides of politics? They both want to help fund Patrick McGorry's youth mental health centres, which believe in early intervention when it comes to adolescent mental health. Is that a good thing?
Yeah, well, mental health, as we know, it touches so many Australians in a direct way. So this is really one of those issues where people are very reluctant to get too partisan about it. I don't think there'd be any Australians, actually, that wouldn't say national health needs to be an immediate priority. It's desperately underfunded. And I think, like the NDIS, both sides have been very smart not to get too nasty about this one.
Simon, do you support it?
Absolutely. I think the big issue in mental health is in the regional areas and access to services for people outside the cities.
Yep.
And I think we need to do a lot more work in effectively delivering mental health services to people. If this money helps start that process, then that's good, but I think we could look at it even more systemically and try and address some of those issues. Because if you're in the country and you're on public health and you've got a mental illness, then you really are struggling for service.
Greg?
Surely the Minister for Cities.
Yeah. Greg, are you more enthusiastic about this policy?
Yes, I shouldn't come across as too cynical about everything, but it is certainly good to hear the announcements today, because last week or whenever it was when the Coalition announced their health policy, and also during the health debate, there was a distinct lack of mention of mental health problems, and I can recall reading Melissa Sweet, who writes the Croaky blog for Crikey, made specific mention of where's mental health, what's going on with that. So it's excellent that both parties haven't forgotten about it, and there does seem to be this focus.
And Simon, it has been underfunded compared to physical health problems, hasn't it? The share of the budget.
And we've seen a massive explosion in the health budget. Over the last 10 years, it's increased by 110% in nominal terms, and it's predicted to increase by nearly that much in real terms. So when you're talking about 10, 20, 40 million dollars as opposed to tens of billions of dollars, certainly the comparison can be drawn there. I think one of the things we need to really focus on, though, is outcomes-based treatment, not systems that, working for the providers rather than for the users of healthcare. We really need to look at not just how much we spend, but how we spend it and where.
All right. Well, our next guest, Margaret Everson, has played a remarkable role in educating the British public about the realities of life for frontline soldiers serving in Afghanistan. In 2009, Margaret's son Mark was leading a patrol in Helmand province when it was ambushed. The 26-year-old Lieutenant Everson was badly wounded trying to get his men out of the line of fire. His life support machine was switched off just 3 days later. Margaret Everson wanted to find out more about her son's death, the reasons behind it, and whether young British soldiers were getting the kind of support they needed as they fought a difficult war in Afghanistan. Now, she shared her son's personal diary with the British newspaper The Daily Telegraph. The diary became a catalyst for renewed debate about the British Army's role in Afghanistan. Margaret Everson has also written her own account of finding out her son's story, titled The Death of a Soldier, and she joins us now. Margaret, welcome to The Drum, and thanks so much for coming in.
Pleasure.
You write beautifully in the book about your son. Tell us a bit about him, what kind of man he was.
Well, he was charming, handsome, very, very caring, and very, very humble. And he was known by his soldiers as 007. He was just a lovely guy, and most people who met him just thought exactly that, what a lovely chap.
He was brave, but he was selfless too, wasn't he? And I thought
yes.
I thought it was telling that the conversation that you had with him before he went to Afghanistan, that he was more concerned that he may make a mistake and jeopardise the lives of others than worrying about his own life.
Yes. Well, I think both he and I probably were not prepared to think about the fact that he might die. I think he probably worried about it, but he certainly wasn't going to discuss it with me, whereas he was prepared to talk to me about his worries about his soldiers and making sure that they were okay.
And that selflessness is what led him to being killed. He was trying to get his battalion out of trouble. Can you tell us what happened?
Well, they'd gone out on patrol, just a small number of men in a very rough part of Helmand, the Nadi Ali district, and they were in a patrol base well behind enemy lines, and it was a Saturday morning patrol. The patrol base, unfortunately, only had 2 routes out of it, one, and both of those, obviously, the Taliban knew, and he'd taken 2/3 of the 2 lots of 10 men, out with him. They were ambushed and quite badly ambushed, so that it looked as if there was fire coming from, I think, north and west, and then subsequently 360 degrees. And I think he must have worried that the whole lot of them would lose their lives. So he was with one half of them. They'd run for cover in a sort of worn down area, and he stood up in a doorway to get comms and to see eyes on what were happening to the other half. And while he did so, he was shot, I think by a sniper, or he might have just been shot by chance randomly.
And he stood up in that doorway, didn't he, because his radio was not working properly, so he had to put himself in the line of fire to get the backup that was needed to save his mates.
Yes, he'd got comms from that place a minute or two before, so he probably thought that he'd get them again. And at the time he stood up, he didn't think, I think that there was firing from that direction. And I suspect he was just a 26-year-old responsible for 20 men for the first time in his life, and I'm sure he was really worried that they would all die. So he probably he may have taken a bit of a risk as well.
Margaret, you went to great lengths to find out what happened to Mark. Why was that so important to you?
Well, I was a parent, and I wanted to know, as any parent would, whether he'd been in pain, and particularly, I suppose, whether he'd lost consciousness. So he was shot about 20 to 9 on a Saturday morning, and he was picked up by the helicopter over a whole hour later. And in that time, he'd been shot in the shoulder, and he basically bled. And I hoped that he'd lost consciousness early in that process. As it happened, he kept going to the bitter end in his sort of stubborn way, really, wanting to force himself to remain conscious so that his chances were better.
And that stubborn way you talk about, finding that out helped you, didn't it?
Yes. Yes.
It helped you keep fighting it through the dark place that you were in at the time.
Absolutely. I mean, I thought to myself, when I knew how he'd been and how brave he'd been, and I was, of course, hugely upset about his death, I thought, well, he'd put up with so much pain and anguish, and the least I could do is put up with a little bit myself. So it did help me hugely, yes.
He was also a very artistic man. He played the cello, he was a great writer, and he wrote a diary when he was over in Afghanistan, and you received a copy of that diary back 2 months after he died. Tell us what you found out when you opened that diary.
Well, it's a beautiful document. It's leather-bound with brown leather on either side. And inside, it's written in pencil. I suspect he didn't have any biros, and he certainly didn't have any rubbers. So there's no crossing out at all, no rubbing out. And it feels as if every single word that he's put down has been planned. He had his grandfather was a missionary in China, and he'd got a copy of his grandfather's own diary written in China in 1940, which he was putting onto his computer for his father. So I think he had that at the back of his mind. He was very admiring of this diary of his grandfather's, and he clearly loved writing. There's a sense about the diary that he enjoyed it. I suspect he was there alone in command with his boys, and I suspect it was both a time to reflect and it was a comfort to him. So it's all written there in tiny, neat writing, exactly what was happening to him. It's very moving when you read it.
It is very moving, and you publish extracts of it in your book, and you, in fact, gave redacted extracts of the diary to the Daily Telegraph newspaper. Tell us what impact that had on the debate in Britain at the time.
Well, it was important, really, and that's partly why I gave it. So this was May 2009, and at the time when Mark died, I think there were about 140 deaths in Helmand. I think Mark was 142. And in the next year, in 2009, there were many, many more. The British public was still reeling from the Iraq War, which is deeply unpopular, and not really prepared to embrace the idea of another war, and very little was known about the war in Afghanistan at the time. And I received this diary which explained in detail how short they were of basics, you know, food, water, batteries, radios, and ultimately men as well. And I thought that the public should know. So my daughter's a historian, and I very well aware of the importance of that sort of material being available. So I thought it was my duty, really, to release it to the public and let the public know. And in fact, many people wrote to me afterwards saying how grateful they were that I let them read it, because it did enlighten them and made them more aware. And I think the British public then, from then on, took more of an interest in Afghanistan.
Simon, you got a question?
Indeed. Margaret, I did some work with the defence industry, and one of the key things here that they focused on a lot was exactly that. You know, the things they were providing to the soldiers were the difference between life and death. And
yes.
One of the things that really interested me in your account was the fact that they were undersupplied in certain areas. Do you feel like the story you shared helped to improve the situation for those soldiers?
Yeah, I think it did. So I also, as every mother did, every mother of a lost soldier in Afghanistan was contacted by the then Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, who wrote to me and said, if Sarah and I can help in any way at all, we would like to. So I thought, fine, I'd like to go and talk to him and explain to him how harsh things were on the ground. So I did, in fact, go to talk to Gordon Brown, and I've set up a little foundation in the UK, the Margaret Everson Foundation, and Gordon Brown offered us a reception at Downing Street some months later. But he did say to me at that reception that going to see him and explain to him as a mother and not as an army general exactly how awful things were had made a difference to him and to how interested he was in the Afghan problems.
Margaret, one of the things I got out of the book too was that I feel like you got an insight into your son that most mothers don't, just from this amazing array of letters that came into you after he died, from friends, from people he'd grown up with, from people who he served with, and also the conversations. If you could just quickly tell us about that.
Well, it's very interesting, really. You have your own relationship with your son, and I'm sure every mother does. And suddenly I found that he had not another life, but he had so many friends, and so many people wrote to me and told me about scrapes he'd got into and things he'd done, that I was able to reconstruct a life that I actually hadn't imagined that he'd had.
Yeah. Yeah, Margaret, thanks so much for coming in. It's a wonderful book. It's called Death of a Soldier, and thanks very much for telling us about it this evening.
Fine. Lovely, yes.
Thanks to all of our panellists, Simon Cowan, Sarah Lamarquin and Greg Jericho, and we'll see you again on The Drum on Monday night. Have a great weekend.